Leah, do you know, I've spent so much of my life reading about this saint and I've never been to his house. Is it your first visit?
Yes.
Right. This is the Southwell family home. Robert is not buried here because, of course, he was martyred and he never had a resting place. But this is where they all are. His aunt, his brother are all buried in that church. Had you even heard the name Robert Southwell before I mentioned him?
Well, I've heard the name.
But of course, you have Edmund Campion, you have Henry Garnet and all those, John Gerard. Robert Southwell is one of the ones who's been forgotten. But I absolutely love this saint. I discovered him by accident, and I was sure that the great saint himself had pointed out his works to me. So I was in the college library trying to find a Catholic writer, because it's all Sidney and Spencer and evil papists and evil cardinals and evil monks, and you know, it gets a bit tiresome when you're the only Catholic in your group. And there he was, SJ. And I thought, that's it. You see, the Holy Spirit obviously guided me to that book. And I ended up doing a whole master's thesis on Robert Southwell's books. He's either Southwell or Southwell. No one quite knows how he would have said it. I just call him Father Robert because, you know, when you spend that much time studying someone's works, you know this from editing and things, you get close to them, you know. And it's extraordinary looking at this building and realising that such a great saint, who is such an innocent soul, just so beautiful as a person, had a grandfather who made a lot of money out of the dissolution of the monasteries. So it's worth saying a prayer for all the people here because, you know, there's been a lot of suffering in this part of the world, you know, with the Reformation and the iconoclasms, and Walsingham is so beautiful, and yet Henry VIII particularly vindictively destroyed it because of his shame, because of the loss of his child. So Robert Southwell was born right in the middle of all of that, in the ruins of England's Catholic heritage, but he wasn't a nostalgic Catholic. He was very much a Catholic Reformation Catholic. He wanted to re-evangelise Britain. That was always what he wanted to do, and of course he then came on the English mission when he was only in his early 20s. You know, they were ordained much younger at the time. One of the things I found most exciting about Father Robert's writings was he was very aware of what had gone wrong in the faith. He was aware of the corruption in the church and the terrible behaviour of some members of the clergy. In one of his spiritual diaries, he wrote something that I found really devastating at the time, that the bad behaviour of priests had made the name of monks synonymous with rogue. And we, through the holiness of our lives, must renew the church, renew the bride of Christ. And of course, reading that when I did at the time when the whole Boston crisis was just exploding, it was devastating because it made me realise this has happened before, but it was also a sign of hope that the church can renew itself through holy priests. And someone like Father Robert really led the way with an incredibly holy and courageous life. But it started in a pretty corrupt corner of the world, and in a place where he could have wallowed in that sense of regret that England had been this beautiful Catholic country and the dowry of Our Lady, and had that sense of trying to turn back the clock. England was never going to be the same again. The church in England was never going to be the same again, but he wanted to make it beautiful for Christ. So, shall I show you the church?
Yes.
Would you like to look?
I'd love to.
I wish we knew a bit more about Robert Southwell's childhood, because it was really one of the few periods of stability he had in his whole life. As soon as he went off to study, then that's when the danger started. There aren't very many stories. The ones there are quite touching. He was apparently called Father Robert by his father, who obviously had some sense that he might move in the direction of the priesthood or be called to the priesthood. He was also abducted when he was a baby by a gypsy woman. She was apparently overwhelmed by how beautiful he was and made away with him. And it's quite moving in a way to consider he had that rather unfortunate contact with the gypsy community because they were also recusants.
Were they?
Yeah, they also, I mean, they probably wouldn't have used that name, but they were nonconformists. They wouldn't attend the established church. They lived outside of society. That's why they have always faced persecution. So both gypsies and Catholics were victims of the priest hunters and the persecution. They were both sets of people were tortured by Topcliffe. We'll learn a lot more about Topcliffe later. So it almost feels as if he had that little early encounter with the gypsy community with whom he would suffer.
Mm.
You know. And of course, as with many Catholic boys who did discern a vocation to the priesthood, he had to go abroad. And it was completely illegal to travel abroad without a permit, so it had to be done in secret. Itself quite dangerous. If he'd been caught on the way to the coast or trying to cross, he could have been thrown into prison. So from the very moment he discerned a need to study for the priesthood, a calling for the priesthood, he put himself in danger. I think he enjoyed his studies. It was an exciting time to be on the continent. We tend to forget, I think we have a very Anglo-centric view of history here. We forget how much Britain cut itself off from the continent at the Reformation. It cut itself off from the cultural life of Europe and the spiritual life of Europe. So to go to the continent was very, very exciting. It was intellectually exciting, but he would have met Catholics from all over the world. He would have met the first Japanese Catholics coming to seminary. You know, this was a very exciting time when the faith became global. You know, you had all those voyages of exploration all over the place and the broadening of horizons, and he very much witnessed that moment in history.
Just tell me a little bit about what Elizabethan England, what the sort of prohibitions were on Catholicism at the time.
The prohibitions were absolute. There's quite a myth that Elizabeth was very tolerant, that she didn't want windows into people's consciences, but in fact it was illegal to be ordained a priest, it was illegal to enter the country if you were a priest, it was illegal to travel abroad without permission. It was particularly difficult for Catholics. There were recusancy laws. Everyone had to attend the established church, so that's why the term recusant exists. It means those who refuse. It comes from the Latin verb, and those who refused faced crippling fines. Many old families were ruined, or imprisonment if they couldn't pay. So it was very difficult. Even owning a Catholic object, a rosary, a prayer book, could put you in danger. And we forget as well how much those prohibitions must have been used to settle scores.
Yes.
You know, if you didn't like your neighbour, you could just claim that they were a traitor, claim that they were a papist sympathiser. It would be very easy to get someone into trouble that way. You had terribly sad cases of people who just got caught up like that. Someone was telling me once, one of his ancestors, everyone has an ancestor who was a recusant if you're an English Catholic, but he had an ancestor who was attending an illegal mass because obviously they had to take place in private rooms and things. And the priest hunters turned up and arrested the priest and took away also the family, because the whole family's lives would be forfeit if a priest was found in the house. And as they were travelling, one of the priest hunters fell and broke his neck. And so this man was charged with murder, simply for having been in the same wagon, and was hanged for murder. So you had a lot of these petty acts of retribution that just went on. And the penal laws were not properly repealed until the 19th century, when you had the emancipation. So this went on for a long time. And I think, in a way, the relationship, that very close relationship between the priests and the laity, particularly lay women, Margaret Clitheroe, famous names like that, is an excellent model for the way the church should be run today. The fact that none of those priests could have carried out their ministry without the help of very, very courageous lay people who were prepared to give them shelter, to have masses held in their homes. When you consider what happened to some of them, and Margaret Clitheroe's terrible death, you know, she was just a butcher's wife, she wasn't a member of the aristocracy. It was something people were prepared to do, though, and that's the extraordinary thing, that in spite of all the laws, the restrictions, the penalties, people, including children, took incredible risks for the faith. There are stories of 12-year-olds and 10-year-olds being arrested and refusing to give evidence. One of the reasons, in fact, Margaret Clitheroe died the way she did was she didn't want her children to be forced to give evidence against her, because they would have been. And I'm pretty sure that Father Robert would have owed his life on a number of occasions to a child quick thinking, hiding something or distracting somebody. You know, the whole family was involved.
Who were these priest hunters? I mean, were they agents of the state?
Yes. Yeah.
Were there many of them?
Oh, well, there was a whole apparatus, and there was a spy network. So in fact, when Father Robert and his companion Henry Garnet left the seminary, before they even arrived in England, it was known that they were coming. It was a very, very sophisticated spy network, and there were constantly spies trying to infiltrate the seminaries, huge suspicion. So there were eyes everywhere. Right from the start, everyone knew they were watching. You could never tell, could you trust your neighbour, could you trust your friend? People were betrayed by their own families. So you had this big spy network, and the priest hunters, when they came to the house, they would cut down walls, they would smash up the place, they would take a house to pieces if they believed there was a priest in there. And if they found a priest, the entire family would be arrested. And of course, the big catch for the priest hunters was Nicholas Owen, because Nicholas Owen was the builder of the priest holes. He was the carpenter. He built every single priest hole differently in different places so that they couldn't get wise. If they found one, they wouldn't be able to find it in the same place somewhere else. And when he was arrested, if he had talked, he could have betrayed almost the entire network. There were many, many recusant families who would have suffered and possibly perished if he'd broken, and he died under torture, in fact. So people became very skilled at hiding priests, but it was always risky. Father Robert did pretty well on the English mission. He lasted 6 years, which is not a bad innings, given the dangers.
Whereabouts was he?
He was mostly in London. He was mostly in the London area. He had a patron, Lady Anne Dacre, who was, of course, the wife of St Philip Howard, or the man who went on to become St Philip Howard.
Who was also a martyr.
It was also a martyr. He's another tragic case. He was actually in prison at the same time as Father Robert, and the Epistle of Comfort that Father Robert wrote was really for him, and it was to help him. You know, he was in prison away from his wife and child. He'd led quite a dissolute life before returning to the faith, and this was a big sacrifice to be making for that change. And his case was particularly horrible because he was a nobleman and he was very well known. They didn't want to execute him, but they never told him. And in those days, you weren't told the date of your execution. Somebody would just knock on the door and you'd be taken out. So every night you'd go to bed knowing that, you know, the next day might be the last day. It's a terrible psychological torture. And Philip Howard went through that day after day after day after day. He eventually died of disease, simply because nobody would do him the favour of telling him, nobody's going to cut your head off, mate. It's not good publicity to kill you. And there's quite a touching story that Philip Howard used to send his dog to Father Robert's cell to get his blessing. Yeah, then the dog would be the sort of carrier of the grace. I'm not sure about the how canonical that is, but it's such a lovely story. But he did start writing when he was a student, and it feels as if somehow that time as a student just gave him a lot of opportunity to develop as a poet as well as a person, because we know that writers have to have that time, that peaceful time to write. It's extraordinary he did so much writing when he was on the run, but it all started in the relative tranquility of his student days. I say relative tranquility because, in fact, being a student at the time was not easy. You had spies trying to get into the seminaries the whole time, a lot of suspicion. You had arguments between the English and the Welsh students, drawn swords on occasion. Can you imagine that? They were not allowed to bear arms once they were ordained, but they certainly didn't have a problem with it when they were students. And of course, Father Robert had his big spiritual crisis because he was drawn in two directions. And he wasn't sure for a while whether God was calling him to the contemplative life, in fact the Carthusians, or to the active apostolate of the Jesuits. And so he had this terrible spiritual struggle, being pulled in both directions. He wrote about it, and then he finally had a sense that he was being called to be a Jesuit. He knocked on the door of the Jesuits and they told him to get lost. They weren't interested. He was refused entry to the Society of Jesus. And of course, for a rather highly strung young man, which I suspect he was, it was a huge blow to his confidence. He would have had a crisis. What had he done wrong? What virtue was he lacking? But in fact, eventually a year later, he was admitted to train as a Jesuit. And that was probably the defining moment of Robert's life. Later on, when he's back in England, he had to answer the smear against young Catholic men that they only ever really went abroad to study because they were lazy and they were stupid, they couldn't get a proper job. And he described his days of studying as, "The rule is austere, the place exile, our wills broken, the least fault chastised, and a most absolute virtue exacted." It didn't really sound like a bundle of laughs on the continent, but it obviously did him a great deal of good, and it was there to train people to go on the English mission and to go into great, great danger. This wasn't a seminary in 1990, it was a time of very, very great fear where young priests, when they went on the English mission, they were going to have to be capable of working independently, to keep calm under pressure, and not to become discouraged. Because once they'd broken away from that spiritual richness of the continent, it would be very easy to start going adrift. So it probably was pretty harsh, but it had to be, because they were going to be working as priests in very, very harsh conditions. When Robert and his friend Henry Garnet were chosen for the English mission, one gets the feeling that the Father Superior was quite worried about it. He described them as lambs to the slaughter. They called themselves 2 arrows shot at the same mark. But if you think about what it would have been like for the rector of a college to see these young men go, knowing they'd probably never see them again, it must have been quite emotional. And Robert wrote a letter before he set sail where one gets the sense he was actually quite frightened. You can sense the fear, the uncertainty. He's got to get on that boat, he's got to go into enemy territory where he's going to be hunted down every moment of his life there. He will never see Rome again, he'll never see his friends again. And in writing that letter, he's seeking some comfort from a father figure he really trusts. And that's part of what makes him attractive as a character. He wasn't fearless, but he was brave.
Yeah.
You know, he got on that boat. There are plenty of others, I'm sure, who would have backed off at that point. But he went. And he had a pretty rough entrance to Britain. The spy network knew he was there. They knew he'd entered the country with Henry Garnet. When he arrived in London, the first thing he saw were the heads of all the Catholics on the pikes on the bridge. So that's not a nice way of coming back to your country. It was almost just a warning of what to expect. But also he realised how much Catholics in London were suffering. They were complaining. They said the Jesuits had abandoned them. There were no priests. They'd not had the sacraments for so long. And he realised he had a lot of work to do. And much of his ministry was in and around London. He visited prisons which were full of Catholics. And some of them were harsher than others. The Clink seems to have been a bit more of a gentlemanly prison. They even had keys to their own cells in many cases. They took time to convert the wardens, which always helped. But then there were also places like Bridewell, the House of Correction, which Catholics dreaded because it was where the prostitutes and the thieves were sent, and it was intended to be an insult. As well as being very rough, it was intended to be an insult to say that they regarded Catholics as the worst offenders, moral offenders in the country. And Newgate, of course, was another hellhole that he would have been very familiar with. There are stories of Catholic families sending their sons to be educated in the prisons because they were full of priests who had nothing else to do other than educate their children, and they became like kind of little little seats of learning, little seminaries, mini seminaries. But we shouldn't forget how difficult it was as well. And particularly for a priest, I think seeing your own people suffering like that was hard, you know. And at the same time, he was writing this incredibly beautiful poetry. He had this whole apostolate as a literary figure, as well as his ministry as a priest. And I still wonder, I find myself wondering how he married those two sides of his life together, because poetry, it's something one tends to associate with a peaceful time, you know, walking the hills like Wordsworth and inspiration, whereas he was scribbling away, you know, hiding in priest holes and, you know, dashing from one safe house to the next. And yet he wrote all this poetry, and he was incredibly popular as a writer. His books went through more editions than Sidney and Spencer. They were the foremost poets of the day. Sidney particularly, there was this whole cult of the young Protestant warrior, because he went and got himself killed quite early. So the fact that he was competing with those what were regarded as the literary greats of the time was quite something. And the Bishop of London liked his poetry so much that he gave it the stamp of approval. This is the Anglican Bishop of London. Didn't realise he was a Catholic priest. He loved the sentiments, the Christian sentiments. Of course, at the time, it was less common for names to appear anyway in printed books, so he was able to get away with that. And his poetry carried on being very popular until the English Civil War, when there was a huge change, huge watershed in Britain. So he had quite a long life as a famous poet, and he influenced other poets. Yeah. He's regarded as the first metaphysical poet writing in the English language, and The Burning Babe, one of his most famous poems, is perhaps can be regarded as the first metaphysical poem in English.
Just explain a little bit what that metaphysical poetry means.
The Burning Babe, it describes, I suppose to the modern mind, it's quite gruesome. The child Jesus is seen in a vision burning, and he's burning because of all the sin of those he has come to save. But he's also giving warmth. You know, he's giving light and warmth to all those around him. And the poet sort of imagines having this vision. There's no suggestion he actually had a vision. It's a piece of poetry, it's a piece of literature. And it was cited by Ben Jonson, the famous playwright, who said that even though Southwell were hanged, he would have destroyed most of his own work to have written The Burning Babe. And of course he then went on to influence John Donne and much more famous metaphysical poets who followed him. Did he influence Shakespeare? The big question, probably. Yeah. Shakespeare would have read his work.
Any particular plays?
Well,
or poems?
The Rape of Lucrece is sometimes cited in terms of just some of the descriptions, particularly the descriptions of the face, which have some resemblance to St Peter's Complaint, which is one of the most, I think, probably one of the finest of Robert Southwell's poems. You know, it's St Peter lamenting, a complaint meant a lament at the time, lamenting his betrayal of Christ. And of course it had huge resonances at the time for church papists who were Catholics who had conformed, because they had no more money. They couldn't, I mean, an awful lot of Catholics did go to the established church because they couldn't pay the fines, they couldn't face imprisonment, they couldn't face losing anything else. And in St Peter's Complaint, there's that constant message, it's all right. So you've betrayed Christ by betraying your faith, you can always come back. St Peter did it, and he became one of the great saints, the great apostle. So there's that message of hope all the way through that it's quite striking, and it's still striking. There's a lot of emphasis in Robert's poetry on the child Jesus. I find it interesting that he focuses on Jesus as a baby rather than Christ on the cross, which would perhaps be a more obvious image for a people who are suffering. But through the child Jesus, you have this image of God, humble, vulnerable, and yet God, and yet divine, that incredible contradiction. And I feel in those poems, those nativity poems, he's just trying to give Catholics hope. you may be losing everything, you may have no power, no earthly power. You know, the chances of a re-establishment of a Catholic monarchy at the time were pretty much lost, particularly when Mary Stuart had been executed. But you know, Christ was also powerless and hungry and cold, just like you. It's all right. And all those messages, that very famous poem that's been set to music by Benjamin Britten, this little babe so few days old is come to rifle Satan's fold. You have all those contradictions. All hell doth at his presence quake, though he himself for cold do shake. That constant, that message, it's just telling the community, don't give up. You must never give up. And the fact that there has been a Catholic minority in Britain throughout that period, throughout the Civil War, through all those many years of the penal laws, that there is still a Catholic community today, is tribute to men like that, men and women who kept witnessing to the truth and kept up the spirits of the Catholic community. And obviously as a priest he was hearing confessions, he was saying Mass, he would have been giving some catechism, some spiritual direction, but of course eventually he knew he would be betrayed. He knew he was very likely to suffer a martyr's death, and that is of course what happened.
Shall we go in?
Yes. That's Robert had an interesting last winter before he was arrested. He was given a safe house, and it was all funded by Lady Anne Dacre, Philip Howard's wife, and he was able to do a lot of writing. We owe it to her that he got so much writing done that winter. Not long after that, he walked into a trap. Most people who are betrayed are betrayed by someone they know. Yes. I would think of the kiss of Judas Iscariot. And there was a family, the Bellamy family. They were very staunch Catholics, well known in the recusant circle. And their daughter Anne was arrested by the notorious Richard Topcliffe. And
who was
he was the chief priest hunter. He had a fanatical hatred of priests, almost to the point of having a psychopathic hatred of them. I mean, it was so overwhelming. He couldn't bear to be seen in the presence of a priest. When Robert was arrested, he had to be held back from killing him on the spot, because that was how far this demonic hatred went. And he was prepared to stop at nothing to find him. Robert was regarded at the time as a giant among the papists. When he was arrested, Richard Topcliffe wrote to the Queen saying, "I never did take so weighty a man." And Anne Bellamy was raped in prison by Topcliffe and became pregnant. And of course she was in a helpless situation. She would never have been able to marry. She would have been deserted by her family. He promised her, if she would betray the priest, that he would find her a husband, his servant Nicholas Jones, and he also promised that her family would not be harmed. Of course, he never kept that promise. Her family were all arrested with Robert, and her mother died in prison. But that was the deal he struck with her. And she was reviled in memory. The recusant community really turned against her because she was a traitor, she was a collaborator. If you think about the way collaborators were treated during the last war, you get some sense of the amount of vitriol that would have been thrown at her. And having said that, through the lens of hindsight, she didn't have a great deal of choice. She was put in a very, very difficult position. But as a result of her betrayal, he was arrested. And the story goes that Robert was able to hide in a priest hole. The priest hunters came, started taking the place apart. He began to realise, as they all realised, that in fact they knew he was there. They had been tipped off. It wasn't just a chance raid. And so he came out of the priest hole himself. Rather than being dragged out, he came out and faced them and basically said, leave everyone else alone. You're looking for me. And that was when Richard Topcliffe had to be stopped from, he drew his sword, a very dramatic scene. And he was taken away to 3 years of a Calvary so terrible that most priests broke under the pressure. He didn't. But what then happened to him was so terrible that even in the 20th century, where some very terrible things have happened, it's difficult to imagine just how much that they were put through. As Catholics, I think we take for granted so much. He was taken to Richard Topcliffe's house. Don't ask me how a man tortured people in his own home, but he did. He had a torture chamber in his house, and he worked on him personally before having to give up and then having him transferred to prison, where they continued to torture him. They used a method called wall torture, which was supposed to be worse than the rack. It was supposed to be impossible to cope with. Blessed John Gerard described it in his memoir, The Hunted Priest. Poor John Gerard has a complex. You can tell he always felt he had been unworthy of martyrdom because he escaped. But if he had not escaped, we would not know nearly as much about what happened to those priests.
Yes.
There's a purpose to everything. And like men escaping from prisoner of war camps, he did have a duty to try to escape. John Gerard described being taken into a room. The way he describes the psychological aspect of it is quite telling to 21st century eyes. They walked him down a corridor, people with lighted candles, very, very sinister. He was taken into a room where there were metal hoops welded into the ceiling, and his hands were manacled and he was hung from the metal hoops. There were steps that were taken away until he was left hanging. And it doesn't sound as bad as some of the things that happened in those torture chambers, but it's apparently impossible to cope with more than about 10 minutes of hanging like that. He described feeling as though there was blood oozing out of his fingertips. It was completely overwhelming. And this happened to Robert Southwell at least 10 times, for hours at a time, each time. William Cecil, who was a great hater of Catholics, went to watch, because that's what nice Elizabethan gentlemen did. They went to watch people being tortured, particularly priests. And he described to a friend afterwards, he said, "We talk about our heroes of old, but there is a method of torture that none can bear, and yet I have seen Father Southwell hanging there as still as a tree trunk, and not one word could they drag from his lips." And we tend to be quite flippant about the heroism of people like that. I don't know how many times you've read a story where they say he was terribly tortured and he never said a word. That was almost impossible. Very few people, even the great saints, the great martyrs, never said anything, because everything was geared towards making sure they did talk. Robert Southwell was one of only a couple who said nothing all the way through, and eventually they gave up and they just threw him in the tower. There's a very touching story, a very distressing story of one of his relatives, I think it was his father, going to see him and seeing him in a terrible state, emaciated, absolutely filthy, lying in straw, covered in lice. And his father petitioned the Queen on his behalf and said, if he has committed a crime worthy of death, let him be put on trial and let him be executed quickly, but treat him as a gentleman. He is a gentleman. He has a right to a trial. And so they did put him on trial. If you think of a Stalinist show trial, that is what he got. It was a foregone conclusion. He was going to be convicted, he was going to be executed, but he had his day in court. There were details even about the trial that were very telling about the sort of person he was. There are all sorts of protocols in English courts that still happen today. For example, you have to enter a plea, even today, as do you plead guilty or not guilty. That in itself is difficult if you're being charged with an unfair crime. Should he have pled guilty? Should he plead guilty of being a priest when that really was pleading guilty to being a traitor, which he wasn't, or not guilty and appeared to be betraying his priesthood? So eventually he said he pleaded not guilty to any treason. He managed to get round it. He didn't want to agree to being tried by a jury because he didn't want his fellow countrymen to have to convict him. He wanted it to be a matter between himself and the judge, but eventually he was forced to agree to a trial by jury, 12 good men and true. But it's interesting that as a priest, he really didn't want to implicate anybody in his death, or he wanted to implicate as few people as possible. He was so weak from torture by the time he was put on trial that he couldn't speak above a whisper, which made it very difficult for him to defend himself. He was being shouted at and talked down, and it was very difficult for him to answer. Everything he did say was twisted to have some kind of nefarious meaning it never had. So when he was asked how old he was, he said he was the same age as Christ when he suffered, 33. And immediately it was, oh, so you think you're Christ, do you? Well, actually he thought he was in persona Christi, which is what all priests are. But every attempt was made to make him look foolish, to make him look ridiculous, to make him look like a narcissist. He had to watch Anne Bellamy give evidence against him in court. She almost certainly would not have wanted to do that, but that was part of the deal, that she had to speak against him. And he was subjected to a huge amount of anti-Catholic abuse. You can imagine it, as he was found guilty, no surprises, and sentenced to be hanged, drawn and quartered. It was the ultimate penalty for treason. So he was taken to Tyburn. There was a whole ritual connected up with the execution of Catholics. Because he was so famous at the time, mostly because of his poetry, the authorities were worried about there being thousands of people there. They thought it was going to be a bit of a celebrity event. Hangings were celebrity events. There was nothing like an execution for a bit of entertainment. And so they kept the date of the execution secret. They had to then schedule a highwayman to hang at the same time so that all the crowds would go that way and not go to Robert Southwell's hanging. And it didn't work. Everyone found out he was being executed, so there were huge crowds there. The condemned were tied to hurdles, which were bits of wood, and dragged through the streets behind horses. They'd get covered with mud. People would throw things at them. It was a real Calvary. Actually, it was very, very like the way of the cross. One of his relatives, who is completely nameless, walked with him, almost like the women of Jerusalem, like Veronica. There's something very poignant about that journey, that sharing of that final journey, until he said to her that she should go, or she would be put in prison again. That's a whole story we know nothing about. She'd obviously been in and out of prison. We don't know who she was, we don't know what happened to her. I find it almost exhausting to consider that when he finally got to the scaffold, bloodied and covered in mud, with his hands tied, that a Protestant minister started picking holes in his Catholic faith. It started having arguments, a theological argument with him. One of his fellow countrymen was about to have his guts ripped out in front of a crowd, and all this man was interested in was scoring points. And eventually, Robert said, please leave me in peace. You could almost like Thomas More sing, you can see how I'm occupied. And normally, the process was very, very brutal. The person would be left hanging, still conscious, and would be cut down while they were still fully conscious, and then they would be disemboweled in front of everybody. Their genitals would be cut off, their head would be cut off, and the hangman, the executioner, would then hold up their head for the crowd. But because he moved everybody so much with his final speech, the final speech was always a very important moment in this whole barbaric ritual, that he came across as so gentle and so forgiving, so obviously not a traitor. Half the people there would have grown up on a diet of anti-Catholic diatribes, actually seeing a priest and realising he was absolutely not that kind of a man, that a number of men mounted the scaffold and pulled on his legs so that he would die quickly. It was like a mercy killing. So in fact, when he was cut up, he was already dead. When a traitor was executed, everyone was supposed to cheer. No one cheered when he was killed. And a member of the crowd, a member of the aristocracy, is said to have remarked, "I cannot answer for his religion, but I hope that when I die, my soul may be in such a state as his."